Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to part 5 of this series of videos on a black repertoire against d4 sidelines. In this last video I wanted to take a look at some actual games. So I've finished with all of the lines I wanted to discuss and just wanted to show you from those final positions I showed at the end of those variations what kind of games might ensue. First I wanted to take a look at a couple of games that are played in the Kala system. Of all these d4 sidelines, in my experience, the Kala system is the one that happens the most often. It's perhaps because I'm a club player, I think maybe it's the most popular of those sidelines at the club level. And I think there's a reason why it's so popular amongst club players. It's fairly easy to play. It's a solid opening for white. It's not taking a lot of risk. And at the same time, it gives white good attacking chances. So a reasonable choice for the club player. Anyway, this first game I wanted to look at was played in 2001 at a French Open. The player with the white pieces is Marcel Marciniak, and the player with the black pieces is Matthias Roeder. I don't have the rating for the player with the white pieces, but the player with the black pieces has a rating of over 2,400 FIDE, so he's a strong player. White goes d4, black goes knight f6, white goes knight f3, and of course at this point I was recommending the move d5. Black in this game avoids d5 for as long as possible, but eventually has no other move or can't find a better move than playing d5. So he plays it somewhat later than, whereas I would just go ahead and play it right away. So black continues with e6, white goes e3. A pretty good sign that white is going for the Kala system with the knight on f3 and the pawn on e3. I think that's all that's left at this point. Black goes c5, white goes bishop d3, black goes knight c6, and white goes c3. So now definitely this is the Kala system with that pawn triangle. And as I said, black can't find anything better at this point but to play d5. So we get exactly the setup that I was going for in my repertoire with the knights out and this pawn formation. White castles here. Black plays bishop d6, putting it on an active square. Knight bd2, castles. And right here in the repertoire, I showed what might happen after white plays e4. And that was just an example, although you might see that in practice because, as I said, the Kala player often doesn't want to memorize a lot of opening lines and is just playing this according to some general rules. And one of the rules is to push e4 whenever you get a chance. But the book line and the most popular move here is actually to take first. And perhaps because of the line I showed, if e4 is pushed right away, then black takes, and that's the line I showed. So taking prevents that. So white gets in the first shot and relocates this bishop to this diagonal. But notice that this diagonal is facing the king, and so there's potential for tactics there, particularly after white pushes e4. White's eliminating the solid pawn formation there in exchange for getting an active game. And so this is the main way that white plays. And black plays queen c7 with several ideas. Queen c7, first of all, stops the immediate e5, so this knight is safe for a moment. Secondly, it vacates the d8 square, so a rook might come over to the d file. And lastly, the queen might get some pressure on the c file or along this diagonal. It's just a good square for the queen. So queen e2, this is also the main move here, renewing the threat of pushing that pawn forward, which black kind of ignores in the way. Black plays h6. And now at this point, white did not push that pawn forward, but he could have. This is actually a playable line. At first it looks like white is going to lose that pawn because knight g4 brings 3 pieces to attack that pawn. But the way it goes, and there's only 2 defenders, so it looks like black is going to round up that pawn. But there's kind of a clever defense that white has here. So white can play the move knight to b3, hitting this bishop, which drops back. And then just seemingly ignoring that threat to the pawn, just bring this knight to a good square. And now letting black take the pawn. Black takes. And after the exchange, playing bishop f4, pinning that knight. And so for a second you might think the tables have turned, but remember that black is a pawn up, so black can give a pawn back by playing f6 here. White can white can eventually get a pawn there, I guess. Anyway, this position turns out to be about even. I mean, this pin might be a little awkward, but yeah, that's what it is. If the queen moves away to unpin, then white can take the knight and then the pawn, so get the pawn back that way. But it is still a good position for black as well. So anyway, that's a playable line for both sides. White avoided that here by playing h3. Just take away that g4 square from the knight, and now really threatening to push e5. So the knight goes to h5. And if you have your tactics hat on, maybe you'll notice that this move makes a threat. And if you want some time to figure out what that threat is, why don't you pause the video here and see if you can find the threat black is making. Okay, I'm giving the answer away now. As I mentioned, this bishop is on a good diagonal here. It's pinning that pawn. And so this knight can hop into the g3 square and fork the queen and the rook. So that's the threat. White meets it indirectly, I guess you might say, by playing knight to b3. And black goes ahead and plays knight g3 anyway. So this is where things start to get interesting. The queen has to move out of the way. The pawn is still pinned. White hasn't taken the bishop off yet. And then now if black meekly retreats the bishop, I guess that will give white a chance to relocate the rook, and nothing much will happen here. So black plays a little more enterprisingly by taking on e4, and so now black's bishop is hanging, but white's bishop is hanging too. So white grabs the pawn, and now black saves the knight by playing knight takes e4, and after queen takes e4, drops the bishop back. So the bishop goes back to d6, and this turns out to be a decent position for black. For one thing, black has the bishop pair now, so in that transaction the light squared bishop got lost, and so that's a long-term edge for black. And I saw a number of games where amongst grandmasters the black player would just go directly for an endgame and try and win it with the advantage of the bishop pair. Let's see, this game goes a little differently. Knight b to d4, that's a good square for the knight. So black trades off one pair of knights and then develops his bishop, so he's getting his pieces out. White goes a4, looking to maybe take advantage of a pawn side majority over here on the queen side. Black plays a6, and white continues with a5. And now black starts to play enterprisingly in the center. Black plays f5. And we're about to see the power of the bishop pair in the middle game. Black is not just going to sit around and wait to take advantage of those bishops in the endgame, but is looking to do something actively with them now. So the queen goes over to h4, and black pushes that pawn all the way to f4, which interrupts white's communication a little bit. It eliminates the idea of a bishop sacrifice on h6, and that pawn is solidly protected, but also it can maybe come forward at an appropriate moment. So white blocks that pawn by playing f3, and now queen to c4 was played. And at this point, white blundered, actually. So white just moved the king. I guess a little bit worried perhaps about this pin, and forgetting that the rook is undefended on the back rank. So the game came to a sudden end here. But I wanted to show that even with best play, actually, white has a winning position here. So the chess engine gives this line: queen to e1, coming back and defending the bishop, so the king is now free to move. e5, kicking the knight. Let's see, b3, kicking the queen first, not retreating the knight immediately, but gaining a tempo, kicking the queen, and then moving the knight to c2. And now black can take here on h3. So this is the power of the bishops. You see that white's pieces have all been pushed back, and black's bishops also have some very good diagonals. So anyway, the idea of this tactic here is that if white takes, the queen will come in, and now the bishop to this diagonal is actually threatening checkmate, and this wins material. White has to block with the rook or something like that. And notice that the pawns are covering these squares, so, well, if he blocks with one of these pieces, he'll lose a piece, or if he blocks with the rook, he'll lose the exchange. And there's still attacking ideas with this rook coming up and over as well. So anyway, lost position for white. So white was in big trouble anyway, but that was where white blundered with king h1. Okay, let's take a look at one more example. This next game was played at the Chess Olympiad in 2016. With the white pieces we have Namkai Batolga, and with the black pieces Anwar Azmagambetov. And they're both have FIDE ratings over 2400, so two strong players. White starts off with d4, knight f6, knight f3, and d5. So you can see that the strong players are not afraid of following my recipe as well. Just wait on d5 until you see something unusual, and then just go for it. So e3, e6, bishop d3, c5, putting pressure on the center, getting that pawn out there. c3, knight c6, knight bd2, bishop d6, and castles. And white castles and black castles. So here, white, let's see, we looked at e4 or the exchange followed by e4. Here white played the move queen e2, which is also one of the main moves besides taking first. And we saw in the previous line that queen e2 followed shortly after this exchange to help support the pawn push. Black goes queen c7. And one point I wanted to make here is that when you set up this battery with queen and bishop, or even in the other order, sometimes you have to worry about a knight coming to b5 there and forking those two pieces. But when white plays the Collis system, there's a pawn on c3, so this knight to c3 to b5 maneuver is not happening. So this kind of battery is much easier to set up, and often it's a powerful idea. Sometimes, as I mentioned, with the pieces reversed, the bishop, say, drops back and the queen goes forward. Anyway, white here continues with h3, and maybe h3 is a little bit slow, but we saw the idea before that white is wanting to take this g4 square away from black. And here black plays very enterprisingly with e5, and that's why I wanted to show this game in particular. If you're playing actively like this and putting your pawns forward at the beginning and getting all your pieces out, then you don't have to be afraid of opening the position. I mean, normally white is the one that has the lead in development and is trying to open the position, but in this case, black has at least an equal share of the center and an equal level of development. And playing e5 here to open things up is a good move. So white takes, black takes, and we get an exchange here of one pair of knights. And then white continues with e4, the very thematic e4. Actually, in this particular position, it seems like it would be better for white to continue with c4. But, well, that would require switching gears, as it were, changing your basic plan. And so white continued with e4. I mean, I think black is fine if white plays c4 as well, but e4 maybe is a bit of a mistake. So rook e8, putting the rook opposite the queen. And, well, white wants to open things up, but it's a little bit risky right now because of that bishop check hitting the queen. So white moves the queen to the side. And let's see, black continues with bishop to e6. Preparing to take back with the bishop and harass the queen some more. So white doesn't take right away, but plays rook to e1. And black continues with c4, kicking the bishop back. And yeah, c4 is sometimes an idea, even if there's not. I mean, in the other game I was showing, c takes d is a way to play. Actually, in the Repertoire series, I was showing that. But there are ideas of pushing the c-pawn forward as well and just gaining a little more space on the queen side. Anyway, kicks this bishop back to c2 and also makes this battery hard to set up because you're controlling squares along that diagonal. Let's see. And after that, rook a to d8. And this is a real picture of centralization. Notice that White's rooks, all of White's heavy pieces are on the central files here. The bishops are on the central file, and the knight is well posted here, looking at the center and defending the king side. So, example of a very harmonious development from Black. And now White slips. It seems like Black is better in this position, but White maybe should just move the queen back to e2. It's hard to move the queen back there when you just came from that square, but that seems to be the best move here. And with just a slight edge to Black. It looks like the queen wants to move so that the knight can come in here and maybe try and take back some of those central squares from Black. But White played the move queen to e3 here, and that walks into a forcing move from Black. Black can push the d-pawn forward, and there's a pretty nice tactic here. If White takes, then Black takes with the bishop, supported by the rook, so the queen moves. Say the queen goes here, and then pushes the c-pawn. So pushing these pawns forward to open up lines, and these are all coming with tempo because this move hits the knight. And now if White takes, then taking with the bishop is a fork. It hits the rook in the corner, and it also hits the knight here. The knight is defended by one piece and attacked twice. So White can't take that pawn. White has to move the knight. Say knight to f3, and now c takes b2, and this is a good position for Black. I think Black comes out of it. Is he going to get? Actually, I think maybe it won't be a pawn up, but he'll have a queenside pawn majority for the endgame. And anyway, it's got the active pieces, so it's a good position for Black. White tried queen to f3, just getting the queen out of the way again, somewhat disheartening. And well, the chess engine would play d3 here, just shutting down this bishop almost entirely. But well, maybe White didn't like the idea of the bishop coming out here, so White played the move queen to a5. So that gives Black a chance to take here and try and unravel. But things are still pretty awkward here for White. Let's see. White played rook e2, maybe preparing to double on the e file, also protecting this pawn so that the queen can move around. The knight goes to d7. This knight is headed for the e5 square, a great centralized square. This knight goes to f1, so this knight wanted to reroute. I guess that was the idea. Let's see if we back up. Yeah, in this position, knight to f1 can't be played because the rook is hanging. So I guess that move, rook e2, is really just to prepare knight f1. So anyway, Black's knight hops into e5. Queen goes to g3. Got kicked around again. Kind of the theme of this game, that queen getting kicked around. This knight goes to d3. Oh, no, it's Black's turn. Black's knight hops into d3. Yeah, after kicking the queen, it hops into this square. And so the bishop goes to d2. White didn't want to give up that bishop and also wants to gain a tempo on the queen, kicking the queen back. Queen goes over to the other side of the board, and now bishop takes d3. And so White is maybe hoping to win a pawn. Actually, there's still this discovered check here, so even White would not even be able to win a pawn right away. But, well, Black finds a clever intermediate move at this point in any case. Black plays bishop takes b2. So clearing this, clearing the aisle here for the rook to come take back the bishop, and at the same time hitting this rook. The rook goes to b1. So rook takes d3, taking back and hitting the queen. So there's no time for Black to grab the bishop. And instead of moving the queen, actually, I don't know if the queen has any good squares. Maybe. Yeah, that looks like a pretty dangerous square to go to. And here maybe. Anyway, White chose to block instead of moving the queen this time. And now bishop to e5 hits the queen. And at this point, the queen is pretty much out of squares. You'll see that the only square it can actually go to is f3. And if the queen goes to f3, White can just exchange out on f3 and then push this b-pawn, save the b-pawn in some way, and just be a pawn up with a passed pawn on the queen side. So that would be a winning endgame. And also, after queen here, queen takes, rook takes, has to take back with a pawn. So the king side pawns will be weak. In fact, the H pawn will be falling right away. So anyway, white tries something drastic here because of the troubles. Tried something different here. Just gave up the queen in exchange for a rook and a bishop. So rook takes d3, bishop takes queen, and knight takes g3. And this was a nice little touch, taking with the knight, hitting the queen, so black doesn't have time to recapture the rook. So the queen moves to c5, and now bishop to e3, hitting the queen again. White's revenge, but the queen goes to a5, and now the rook moves. Rook drops back to d2, and white goes b5. Black goes b5, but this is just a great position for black. The queen is more powerful than the rook and the knight, and these passed pawns over here on the queen side are going to win the game. Let's just go through the rest of it because it ends shortly. Let's see, rook d to b2 was played, doubling on the b pawn. a6 was played. Now bishop to c5. Queen goes to c7, hitting the bishop. Bishop goes to d4. Rook comes to d8. Rook goes to d2, and now c3. And white just resigned at this point. The problem here is that after this exchange, there's this fork, and so white is losing even more material. So this move c3 is just winning. Well, I suppose the rook could drop back and defend the bishop, but at this point, white decided he had had enough and gave up. Well, if the rook drops back, then this pawn is coming forward with tempo and forking the two rooks, isn't it? Anyway, a nice win for black there, and a good example of centralization. Okay, next I wanted to look at a couple of examples from the London system. This game was played in the Abu Dhabi Masters in 2017 between Viktor Arshavsky and Bada Pratyusha. These two players were both rated over 2,100 FIDE, so not as strong as the players in the previous game, but still quite strong. I mean, that's equivalent to a national master in the U.S. White started off with d4. Black went knight of 6, and white went bishop f4. So it looks like white is going for some kind of London system. Black just plays e6 here. White goes e3. White goes d5. And black goes d5, and white goes knight f3. Yeah, so now this is definitely the London system. And after c5, c3, we have pretty much the complete setup. So knight c6, we're getting the main line of the London system and also the repertoire position that I showed. Bishop d3, bishop d6. And the bishop just drops back to g3, the most common move there. Black castles, knight bd2, and b6. So, yeah, b6, that's right. Black is completing the setup. This is where white starts to play interestingly. Notice that white has not castled yet, and is just going to go for an immediate kingside attack and try and take advantage of this rook in the corner. So as long as white is not castled, you probably don't want to trade and open up that H-file. You don't want to give white a free tempo in that regard. So watch how this game goes. I just wanted to mention, though, the main moves here are knight e5, after which black can continue with bishop b7 and then castles. And then, potential exchanges are going to be fine. The other way of playing it is that white will often play queen e2 here. And once again, bishop to b7 and castles, and also a fine position for black. But in this game, white went e4 immediately. And black didn't take. I think I would be inclined to take here. I like to kind of simplify the position and get rid of a couple of pieces when it looks like I'm going to come under attack. So for example, d takes e4, knight takes, bishop takes. And maybe it looks like a little bit of trouble here, but you have time to, because of the pin, I mean. But you have time to defend the bishop, and then say after this exchange, white could even try something like this. but you can bring the rook over, not there. Let's go back. Bring the rook here to c8 and defend. And this pawn is off limits because if the queen takes it, the rook can come back and trap the queen. So rook to d1 and queen to e7 and castles. That is how it might go. And I think this is a playable position for black as well as white. And I think if you want some ideas here, maybe knight to a5 there, and just get rid of the bishops on the light squared diagonal there would be a way to continue. Maybe not. I was just realizing you have to watch out for b5, so maybe you don't want to do that while that knight is, b4 while the knight is on c5. Anyway, that's not how the game went. In the game after e4, black just retreated the bishop to e7. Black has to watch out for that fork. That's why you either need to take or do something at that point. So black chose to retreat. White pushed on with e5, and white went knight d7. So actually it's starting to look a bit like a French defense with this pawn structure. Well, once again, white hasn't castled and is just going for this quick attack on the h-file. Black goes h6, and white goes knight g5. So the famous fishing a pole attack. That's part of why I wanted to show this game, is a nice example of how to deal with the fishing pole. So you don't have to take that knight right away. And in fact, taking is a mistake. I think it loses almost immediately. If you take bishop h7 check, even if you don't take at this point, the queen is still going to come over to the h-file and threaten things. So might as well take queen h5, king back to g8. Let's see, and then white is going to take here. The point of the fishing pole is that exchange has that free knight has opened up the h-file. There's a mate threatened. If you play f5 to get out of the mate, white can push on with g6, and the mate is now unavoidable. And there are other ways to play that, of course, but they all end up losing for black. So don't take the knight right away. Make sure it's safe first. But you can start undermining the center. C takes d4. That's why we have these actively placed pieces and pawns out here, is to take advantage of that. White takes back, and now actually knight takes d4, and black is actually just winning here. This knight has nowhere to go. This knight is coming over to defend, and also white's center has been dissolved. So anyway, that would be the simplest win. Black didn't play that way. Black played with knight to b4, harassing this bishop. But that kind of invites bishop to h7. It makes things a bit complicated. So the king runs here, and black is still better in this position, but it just would have been simpler to take that d-pawn. Anyway, and then white continues with queen h5. A pretty typical kind of move, and what you would often expect from the sort of player who's going to play the fishing pole. But actually that move loses. So just to show you what white needs to do to try and salvage this position, queen to b1 needs to be played here to protect the bishop. The point is that this knight here is kind of fragile, and if you don't want to just retreat the bishop and you want to try and hold on to this position, you need to defend that. And then, well, queen e8. Let's give a few moves here. a3, kicking the knight back, knight to c6. This knight comes to f3, f5 now, opening up some space on the king side, make it easier to defend after the knight takes. Maybe a rook will come to f7 there, and then he takes f6. So white takes en passant and bishop takes. And this is a position which is maybe a little better for black, but playable for white as well. He's still got the attack going. And anyway, yeah, it's not a simple win in any case. So that would have been best play for white. But anyway, white didn't play that way with queen b1. White was just focused on the attack and went queen h5. And now you can just take the knight. As long as you take with the bishop here, the thing is you're still going to win a piece. And this h-file will open up, but only partially, because after king takes, you're a piece up, and you still have something on the h-file here. And now you might wonder what happens when white takes, but we'll get to that. But white played knight f3 first, which is a reasonable move, and black played bishop to a6, which at first is just defending along the back rank. It's just opening up and connecting all the rooks and heavy pieces along the back rank, and we'll see that that's very useful. But as a second thought, it's also taking squares away from the king. So we'll see that come into play shortly as well. So anyway, now white takes. So this is very important to play this correctly. You don't want to take there. You just want to push this pawn forward and keep that h-file shut. And now we see why white threw in that move knight to f3, because the knight can hop in here to g5, kicking the king back. But there's really no progress to be made from this point. So white tries some desperation moves at this point, but basically he is losing and can't find a winning continuation here. So he tried knight takes f7 just to complicate things, as it were, maybe hoping to get a perpetual check or something. Rook takes f7, queen takes g6. So completely blowing away the pawn cover around black's king, but there's quite a few pieces here around the king as well. And let's see, in terms of material, there's a queen, 2 rooks, and a bishop. There's a queen, 2 rooks, and yeah, so white is down 2 pieces. So that's a pretty heavy material disadvantage. Anyway, black brings the queen over to defend. White grabs this e-pawn and tries to stir up trouble, basically. The queen goes to h7, and notice now that it's nice that the bishop has lifted off the back rank, because this rook is protecting the back rank. The queen can't come here, and this queen and rook are protecting the second rank. So things are pretty safe here for black's king. Rook d1 was tried. Might have been better to just castle queenside. Was that possible there? Maybe there's a problem with that. Yeah, I suppose the problem with castling queenside is the knight can take here with check. That might be kind of annoying. And the king would be on the open file, so there'd be checks here. Anyway, he tried rook d1, and this loses almost immediately. So if you want to find the move from black that wins the game here, yeah, pause the video if you want time to think about it. I'm giving the answer away now. It is queen to e4 check. Don't forget that your defensive pieces can be offensive as well. And now notice this bishop has sprung to life, preventing the king's retreat in this direction. The king ran to d2, and the queen came to d3 with check. And white resigned, because wherever the king goes, he will get mated next, either with the queen on c2 or on on e2 there. So anyway, short game, but kind of fun. Let's take a look at another one here. The next game I wanted to show you is also a London system. This was played in the US Pro League in 2017. And by the way, I was mentioning the Kala system is the one that's played most often at the club level, at least in my experience. But of the minor sidelines, I think the London system is the one that's the most popular at the top levels. And we see two strong players trying it out here. We have, with the white pieces, we have Yakov Norowitz, and with the black pieces, we have Oliver Barbosa, and they're both rated over 2,400. So white goes d4, black goes d5, white goes knight f3, black goes knight f6. So black is actually following my recommendations here. White plays bishop f4, so we know we're in the London system now, and black goes with c5, putting early pressure on the center, like I was suggesting. e3, knight c6, more pressure on the center, c3, and now e6. So after c3 shows up, then you play e6. So that's exactly the move order I was showing in my repertoire. Anyway, white continues knight bd2. Black goes bishop d6. Bishop drops back to g3. Black castles. White goes bishop d3. And black goes b6. And here white goes knight e5. So in this position, I think bishop to b7 is still a playable move, but black tries something interesting. He plays knight e7 first, and he's doing this in conjunction with bishop b7. The bishop is still going there, so this queen goes to e2, and then this bishop goes to b7. And black is playing for a kind of clamp here on the e4 square, and at the same time, this bishop is being, this knight, the knight is being rerouted to a different square. So after white castles, this knight comes out here to f5. So pretty interesting play, and it's sort of a challenging, it's challenging white to say, do you want to take that knight and give me those doubled pawns? And white does. If white doesn't take, black could get the bishop pair by taking here. If white wants to save the bishop pair, it is possible. White could play like this: bishop f4, knight e4, say rook to d1, and queen to c7. And this seems like an okay position for both sides. You have to wonder if this bishop out here, though, will run out of moves at some point. But anyway, for the moment, white can continue to hold on to the bishop pair if he really wants to. But white chose to take and give black the doubled pawns in exchange for the bishop pair. And then this bishop went to h4. Maybe that was what white spotted and liked the idea of that pin. So black drops the bishop back to defend against that pin, unpin, because this knight really wants to hop into this square. At some point, the queen comes out to f3, taking a look at the f-pawn here, and the knight goes into e4 right away. So there's a threat to take the bishop, no time to grab the pawn, so bishop takes, queen takes. And now white's queen went to e2, because at this point the knight is hanging. So queen to e2 was played here. And then this knight dropped back to d6. So it's interesting that black was not keeping the knight there forever, but this is a good square for the knight as well. Just keeping an eye on that central square and also holding on to the f-pawn. So white played rook f to e1, and black goes f6, so chasing the knight out of his good square. This knight drops back to d3. So both of these knights have used the central square to reroute. This knight went like that, and the other knight went the other way, but they did a similar maneuver. Now bishop to a6, pinning that knight, kind of an annoying move. So knight to f1. This knight is going to reroute and try and get into the game. C takes d4. We get a little bit of kind of maneuvering here. It seems a little strange that black is willing to take on this isolated pawn, but he does have ideas of pushing this pawn forward in the right circumstances, and it seems like this is okay for black. Let's see, rook a to c8. Yeah, after the exchange, rook a to c8. Queen went to d1. And the knight went back to e4, and this time white chose to kick that knight and drops back to d6. So the knight maneuver did accomplish a little something in that it created a weakness on e6, but well, it remains to be seen if anything can be done with that. White continues maneuvering with knight to g3, hitting this pawn again, so g6 is played, defending it, and knight to f4. So the knight got unpinned by that queen maneuver, so now the knight is coming over to the king side, and it's also taking a look at this central pawn here. So the bishop drops back to b7 to defend it, queen to a4, and knight to c4, getting that knight to a good active spot and taking a look at this weakness here, and now b3, kicking the knight. So now there's some interesting play here. I just want to point out that once again, the queen can't take the a-pawn because rook will come over here. And notice the knight is defending b6, so that traps the queen over there. But the knight is kind of a crucial part of that. So b3, encouraging the knight to move, is a bit of an annoying move. So black avoids that by playing bishop to c6, kicking the queen. Queen goes here, the bishop goes back. So there's this little dance with the queen and the bishop. And then at this point, white decides to not repeat. Maybe black was offering a draw. I mean, it was only twice, so it's not for certain that it would have been a draw. Maybe black had some other idea. But in any case, white chose to deviate first by taking on d5. So white can take, and then black can get rid of this annoying knight here But of course, at the moment, the a-pawn is defended by the queen. So this all turns out to be materially equal. And white has these center pawns, but the e-pawn is still maybe a little bit weak. And these pawns on the queen side here are going to be a long-term advantage for the endgame. And plus black has a bishop versus a knight and active pieces. So it seems like a decent position for black still. The queen went to b5, hitting the bishop, and the bishop dropped back to f7. Let's see, rook a to d1, putting the rooks, centralizing the rooks and preparing to push these pawns forward. But black is going for counterplay with rook to c2. a4, maybe softening up the pawns over on the queen side. h5, preparing to chase this knight away to a less friendly square. Notice this knight does not have a lot of moves. These pawns are covering squares the knight might like to go to, so it's going to have to drop back this way when it gets kicked. But white ignores that for the moment and pushes on with d5. No, I'm sorry, pushes on with d5. Let's see, and black goes with h4. The knight drops all the way back to f1, and then rook to d8. And so now e4 is played. So white is successfully moving these pawns forward. But when the e-pawn comes forward, white can black can trade it off, get rid of his doubled f-pawn here. I'm sorry, white took with the rook, gaining a tempo on the queen. But in any case, black is getting rid of his doubled f-pawn. But it may look like like white is getting a pawn too, but black has ideas. So let's just watch how this unfolds. So the rook is hitting the queen. The queen goes to a3, looking to activate on the king side here. Black grabs this pawn, but white grabs this pawn, but black has rook to c5, chasing the queen to a6, and black can grab this pawn. So still materially equal at this point. There's this further exchange. Rook takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now finally white grabs the pawn on a7, thinking that it is safe at this point. Well, notice that if the rook comes over here, in addition to the queen having an escape over here, it can also escape this way and deliver a pretty devastating check against the king over here, maybe even mating. I didn't look at that. So it looks at first blush like this is a safe time to grab that pawn. But, well, it's black's move now, and black has some nice ideas in this position. First of all, it starts with this check, queen to c5 check, driving the king into the corner. The knight can't block. It'll just get taken. So the king runs the corner, and now the bishop drops back. And that's a very nice interference move. So there's no longer this coordination between white's queen and white's rook, and so there's no longer this mate threat. And in fact, this knight is in big danger of being lost. It has no good square to run out to. It could run out to g3, I guess, but then there's this mate on the back rank. So white is actually in severe trouble right now, and tries to get out with a pretty clever move. Rook to h8 check, sacrificing the exchange here, because after king takes, queen takes bishop, in exchange for getting this position here where maybe white could find a perpetual check or some other way to save the position. But black has calculated this out and ignores those threats for the moment and just plays rook to d1. Of course, this is a pretty severe threat too. That's a mate there, and there's no defense, no way to defend that pawn. So white goes for the checks. Queen takes f6, king h7, queen f7 check, king h6, queen f4 check, king g7. And at this point, there are no more checks and no way to save the knight. If white wants to avoid getting mated, he has to push a pawn forward, and then this knight is going with check anyway. So white is just going to be black is just going to be a rook up, and white will lose shortly. So at this point, white resigned. Okay, nice game. Let's take a look at the next game. Lastly, I wanted to take a look at a couple examples of the Stonewall Attack. This first one, I think I will just show a fragment of the game because both players kind of were not, the players were not that strong, and the game wandered away from the best lines pretty quickly. But it has a couple of interesting tactical points I wanted to show, so we'll get to that. So this started out with d4, d5. This game was played in a German Open in 2010, by the way, and the players are rated 1400 and 1900 respectively. So let's see, e3, knight f6. So we get this standard setup here, and the e3 move that indicates, along with bishop to d3, that white is going for the stonewall. That goes e6, knight to d2. Avoiding committing the f-pawn for a while, bishop to d6, c3, castles, f4, c5. So now we're starting to get that standard setup. Knight to f3, knight to c6, castles, a6. What I wanted to say here, first of all, is the examples, or in the repertoire, I was looking at the immediate knight to e5. There's basically two main moves for white here, either knight to e5 or castles, usually followed by knight to e5. And the immediate knight to e5, I was suggesting the move knight to d7. It's kind of a simple way to play, and just offer to trade that piece off. But there's a more active way to play after knight e5, which is queen b6, and that's why I wanted to show you this game, because we get the queen b6 move, although it's delayed. So white castled, black played a6, white went knight e5, and now black goes queen to b6. And this is pretty interesting because there is tactics along this diagonal, well, we'll see that in just a minute. White pushes on with g4, very typical, just gung-ho, go for the attack, and the knight retreats to d7 now. Yeah, part of that knight d7 idea. I mean, I was playing knight d7 so I could play f6. Here, black is playing knight d7 just to get out of the way of those pawns, and white continues to push on with g5. And now, if you want to, can you see if you can spot some tactical ideas in this position for black? Okay, yeah, there are some nice tactics already. I think black is already winning with good play here, and it all has to do with this this diagonal and tactics on it. So it starts with the move c takes d4, and there's two ways to take back. So the first point is that if white takes with the e-pawn, then this is under-defended because there's a pin here. You can just take like that, and because of that pin, there's no way that it's not legal for white to take that back. So that's a way of just snagging a center pawn, and that is certainly good for black. So that was not played. Actually, yeah, this whole line was not played in the game. It got played a moment later, but this was the right moment to strike. The other way of taking was to play c takes d4, and this still fails to a different tactic, but it also has to do with that diagonal. So if you want to think about this position, what's the tactic in this line? Okay, I'm giving the answer away now. The idea here is that you can take this knight off, and if white grabs with this pawn, you can grab here on e3 with check. So white takes with the other pawn, but you can still take on d4 because after white takes back, you take back with check and pick up the loose bishop there. So if we go back to this position where white played g5, back up. So white had to be aware there were already these tactics in the air. One of the tactics is the idea of the pin here, making this piece, whatever ends up on e5, under-defended. And the second idea is that a trade that ends up with a queen on the d4 square is going to fork the king and the loose piece right here. So you have to trade off that knight first before you can make that tactic happen, but they're both in the position. Okay, let's take a look at the next game. This is the last game I wanted to show, and this is another example of a Stonewall attack. I did want to add that Stonewall attacks, like the Collar system, are more popular at the club level than they are at the top level, so I had some trouble finding games to show you. But this was a pretty interesting one. This was played in the Ukraine Under 16 Girls Championship in 2006. And with the white pieces, we have Elena Samostral, and with the black pieces, we have Lila Mammadova. So it starts off d4, d5, e3. So this non-committal move that could lead to either the Kala system or the Stonewall. Black goes with e6, bishop d3. Now it's starting to look more like a Stonewall, knight to f6. So we have this common setup from black, and f4. So white commits to the Stonewall early, not bothering to keep the mystery. So c5, c3, putting pressure on the center. Knight to c6, getting the knight to an active square. Knight f3, bishop d6. So just the way I was playing it in the Repertoire series. Knight bd2, castles, and this is a point where knight e5 or castles, and white chose castles here. And black went with b6. So black just continued with this setup of bishop to b7, the standard setup that I had in many of those games, and bishop to b7 now. So the queen comes out to f3. This is an idea in the Stonewall. The queen will come to f3 instead of the knight. Sometimes an interesting way to play. So the rook goes to the c file, very logical development. Now the queen from f3 is hopping over to the h file, and notice that the queen and the bishop are triangulating on h7, so you have to always be aware of that. So knight to e7 was played at this point. And this is a nice idea here. We saw knight e7 in the previous game, but a similar idea where the bishop behind the pawn combined with the knight is going to help stop up this diagonal. White continues with g4, just pushing on with the attack, and the knight hops right in here to e4. And now probably white needs to just give up and take that knight off. White tried something different, we'll get to that, but if white takes, then the pawn takes, and then the bishop drops back to e2. And this is a position which is playable for both sides, but black should be able to defend this. Having closed down this diagonal, some of the mating threats have been stopped. There's still ideas here for white, of course. White is going to continue to press the attack, but black can defend. Anyway, white just continued and played this clever move. Notice the knight, because of the mate threat, the knight is pinned, so white is not sacking the exchange or anything. It's just putting the rook on f2 to go over to g2, I guess, and maybe get some pressure on the g file. But that seems to be a little bit of a mistake, and white can, and black strikes here, as so often with exchange in the center, starting with softening up the center here, followed by f6, kicking the knight. And now notice that both these pawns have been kept back, so this knight can't come into the g6 square, has to go back. Although first white throws in this exchange, takes off the knight, and then this knight goes to the c4 square, hitting the bishop, and the bishop drops back. But this is already quite a good position for black. These two bishops looking at the king side, and white's exposed king here, mean that actually white is in more trouble than black is in this position. So let's just go forward some moves here. White pushes on with f5, and black just exchanges and then gets this knight forward to a good square. And then instead of exchanging here, puts the knight on f4. So black is not in a hurry to exchange pieces. I mean, I would be tempted to, but well, this knight f4 square is coming with tempo, and it's also looking at d3, which is a great outpost for the knight, so that's definitely a good move as well. Let's see, queen to g4. So switching to the g file, the queen goes to c7, and notice with the pawns moved forward, this is a pretty good defense along the second rank there. The open lines on the second rank give black those defensive possibilities. Let's see, so this knight, the knight on the d knight went to f1. So this is going to try and join in the attack somehow. This rook goes to, the c rook went to d8. So the rooks are being centralized. I guess this is maybe keeping that pawn from coming forward. Let's see, knight to g3, hitting the hitting the e pawn, and then rook f to e8 was played. Actually, that pawn is defended, so the chess engine is saying knight to d3 is the best move for white here. But anyway, this is okay as well. Rook f to e8 still keeps, I mean, the best move for black. This still keeps some edge for black. And then knight to h5. I guess what it is this trades off this knight here, which is a pretty nice piece, whereas if the knight had gone to d3, it wouldn't get traded off. But, well, black probably felt it was safer to have that knight available to trade. This does kind of defuse white's attack over here. And then b5, so black is in a position to just undermine these pawns over on the queen side. And now knight to d1. And this is actually the losing move because it gives black an opportunity to push this e-pawn forward and open up that diagonal towards the king. And that turns out to be fatal. Black doesn't jump on that right away, but throws in queen c6 first. And now the best move for white is to either move the knight or the bishop back to that e3 square and blockade. But, well, white had different ideas. White went with a3. And now it's all over after e3. So e3 comes with a mate threat. The rook has to move. And it also has to block the diagonal. So because this pawn is also joining in on the mate threat. Now I suppose that white could, or black could just take the rook here, but pushing on with e2 seems even stronger, and it's all over now. Let's see, bishop to d2 to try and stave off the mate, or the queening of the pawn, and so black queens anyway, and takes the knight while at it, and then white takes back, and then now grabbing on f3. I guess that was there all along, but you get a piece by pushing that pawn first, and after queen takes, bishop takes, white decided to resign, not play on here, being down a rook and a bishop, and these two pawns. This is a passed pawn, but it's not going to be enough to overcome black's material advantage at this point. So anyway, interesting game, and just some ideas of how to play the Stonewall. So hope you guys enjoyed this series, and that's it. I will be back soon with my regular programming. I'll see you then. Bye.